evening, Fantasy Nation. Welcome to JohnnyFreakInFantasy Week 13. This will be my last and final podcast for this fantasy football season. With the playoffs right around the bend, I'm only going to do the waiver wire pickups for the regular season. So without any further ado, we're going to get into our Week 13 running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends. This week we have 19 offensive players and 10 defensive players, so a total of 29 to talk about. With a lot going on this week, especially with our running backs, first and foremost, we see Leonard Fournette suspended this week. Melvin Gordon's going to be sidelined, so automatically by default, I'm not going to talk about these players in depth, but Austin Eckler and TJ Yeldon in that order, respectively, I would go and pick them up if they're available. Eckler's owned in 71% of leagues. He had a big week last week and filling in for Melvin Gordon, and TJ Yeldon looks to bring back that role he once had while Leonard Fournette was out earlier in the year and owned at 60% of the leagues. I'm not going to talk about them in depth, but these guys are big playmakers that I do think would be a great ad for you trying to fight for a final playoff spot this week. So Eckler and Yeldon would be my default number 1 and 2 for running backs. My number 1 running back this week is Carlos Hyde from Jacksonville. He's owned in 38% of Yahoo leagues. And like I said, TJ Yeldon's probably not going to be available. And Carlos Hyde, although his only game without Fournette, he only had 6 touches in that game. That was 2 weeks after he was traded from Cleveland to Jacksonville. So I do expect his role to expand there, especially with the flux that they're in at quarterback. They're going from Bortles. They said they're sitting Bortles now and starting Kessler. So who knows? They could switch that role up again. I don't know. That's a mess there. So I do expect them to run it. That seems to be one of the most successful bets they've had, is just running the ball with their running backs this year, whether it be Fournette or Yeldon out of the back. So I do like Carlos Hyde, even if you're not available to get Yeldon. Carlos Hyde to me is a solid flex. Moving on to number 2, and that's LeGarrette Blount from Detroit, owned in 15% of Yahoo leagues. This is all dependent on Kerryon Johnson's health, although I don't think Kerryon Johnson's going to come back this week. It looks cloudy at best. I expect him to sit, especially this week, and especially the way that LeGarrette Blount ran. He had 88 yards and 2 touchdowns versus Green Bay on Thanksgiving, so I don't expect the Lions to really feel too bad about sitting Kerryon Johnson this week. I think LeGarrette Blount is a safe start versus the Rams. It's not the toughest of matchups. We've seen the Rams have a tough time against the run. I think he and both Theo Riddick are viable flexes this week. So if you're in a bind, LeGarrette Blount might be the man you need to look for. Number 3 is Nyheim Hines from Indianapolis, owned in 22% of Yahoo leagues. And this is all dependent on Marlon Mack's health, of course. He exited with a concussion late in Week 12. And Hines, he had 28 yards on 9 carries, as well as 2 catches for 22 yards. And that's his mantra, kind of that passing back in that offense. Jordan Wilkins seems to be the preferred back on first and second down. Nyheim Hines, that we've seen have a lot of success earlier in the season, so I do think he could pay dividends for you. Again, this is dependent on Marlon Mack. If he's able to suit up, I wouldn't consider Nyheim Hines in my starting lineup in a risky situation if I'm trying to win this week and get into the playoffs. But if I do have some comfort, I wouldn't mind starting Hines even if Marlon Mack returns. However, if Marlon Mack returns, that does put a damper on the situation, and I would highly consider starting Marlon Mack with confidence. But if Marlon Mack does sit, I think Nyheim Hines is going to have a nice game in Week 13 for you. My number 4 waiver wire running back for this week is Frank Gore from Miami, and in 26% of Yahoo leagues. The ageless wonder outtouched Drake 14-8 in Week 12. And in the last 2 games, he's secured 157 rushing yards. He does seem to have a nice yardage floor at worst. And it's no given that Kenyon Drake plays this week. So I do think Frank Gore is someone you need to target in your waiver wires. He's playing Buffalo's defense, who has a top passing defense. So I think the Dolphins are going to be forced to run a little bit more. I would consider him a nice flex play for Week 13. Again, Frank Gore is my number 4. Number 5 is Rex Burkhead from New England, owned in 19% of Yahoo leagues. He is eligible to play this week, but his role is uncertain. While James White and Sonny Michel both have played well this season, I do think that Burkhead should still get somehow involved. I do think he still needs to be rostered until it's shaken out, until it's all settled. You have to think that Sonny Michel is going to get rest at some point, and Rex Burkhead. They're going to want to use him to kind of take some light off of James White and Sonny Michel. So I don't think he's startable at all. He's not. I wouldn't recommend him in any leagues this week, but I do think he's a strong bench player for the playoffs moving forward. And that wraps it up for our running backs. So we're going to move into our wide receivers. And my number one wide receiver add this week from Tampa Bay is Adam Humphries, owned in 31% of Yahoo leagues. He continues to share really nice chemistry with Jameis Winston. He doesn't pile up huge yardage, but he sees a lot of targets, and he's utilizing the red zone, which makes him very important in that offense. He gets Carolina in Week 13, who he dropped 8 catches for 82 yards and 2 touchdowns in Week 9. So with O.J. Howard on IR now and Deshaun Jackson hurting as well, I would advise to pick up Adam Humphries. I think he's a good investment for your waiver wires this week. That's why he's my number one wide receiver for this week. Moving on to number 2, Josh Doctson from Washington, owned in 12% of Yahoo leagues. He had 6 catches on 10 targets for 66 yards in Week 12, which is highly considered his best game. Colt McCoy has targeted Josh Doctson 15 of his first 50 throws, 30%. He has another nice matchup versus Philadelphia this week. I like Josh Doctson's chances as a wide receiver 3 or a flex for the rest of the season. I think he has a chance to right the ship, and I would hop to get on that ship. I do like Josh Doctson as my number 2 wide receiver this week. My number 3 receiver is Trey Quinn from Washington, owned in 1% of Yahoo leagues. I talked about this guy in a nice way last week, and I started him on Thanksgiving versus Dallas, and I smiled all night. He had 5 catches for 26 yards and a touchdown. While the yardage hasn't been much this season, he's had an exciting 10 targets the last 2 games with Colt McCoy at the helm. I do consider him a flex play at Philadelphia, who allow 276 yards per game in the air. So I do think Trey Quinn is a nice add this week. Safe start. I would consider him. For the people that played him last week, kudos to you. Coming in at number 4, David Moore from Seattle, owned in 11% of Yahoo leagues. After 3 fading weeks, Moore returned to his scoring ways in Week 12, posted 4 catches for 103 yards and a touchdown. He still has a role in his offense, and especially in the red zone. He had a big play 54-yard catch, which was the longest of his young career. I would consider him a safe flex play versus San Francisco, who have allowed over the last 5 games 7 touchdowns to wide receivers. So I would consider him a nice flex play for this week. At number 5, Bruce Ellington from Detroit, owned in 2% of Yahoo leagues. He looks to be the number 2 in the pass game now. 16 targets over the last 2 games. Marvin Jones, he's on IR now. So I think Bruce Ellington, especially in PPR leagues, has a nice little value. He's still in a lot of leagues, 98% of Yahoo leagues. I don't think he has much upside in this offense, but I would still consider him a wide receiver 4 or a flex start this week. And I do like him for the rest of the season, given the volume. And my last receiver, number 6, from Carolina, Curtis Samuel, owned in 9% of Yahoo leagues. He has had 6 touchdowns in 8 games so far this year, which is pretty impressive. He doesn't get many targets, but he plays all over the field. The Carolina Panthers have obviously found different ways to get him the ball, rushing. He plays on special teams, he's a return threat. So I do like him. He needs to be owned in deeper leagues now that he's showing some consistency, especially in return yard leagues. I would consider him a big play wide receiver 4 or flex. And I do like Curtis Samuel to continue to find success this week, Week 13. And before I go into my tight end rankings, I want to talk about 4 different wide receivers to consider only in the deepest of deep leagues. These guys are going to get you either 15 or 0 points, very risky. But if you're in a very big gamble this week to go into playoffs, you might need to take a look down this deep. My number 1 guy, biggest bust or boom, is going to be Robert Foster from Buffalo. In the last 2 games, he's had 5 catches for 199 yards and a touchdown. Obviously has big play potential oozing all over him, but he cannot be trusted in Buffalo. In that offense, I don't think you start him unless you're in the deepest of trenches and you need to find your way out. So number 2 is Marquise Goodwin from San Francisco, owned in 46% of Yahoo leagues. He's always a long touchdown threat. He's a little bit banged up. We'll see if he comes out healthy. Keep in mind, Mullins is no safe gamble to keep the ball all the way through the game. They've threatened him with a short leash now, and C.J. Beathard, we might see him again. So Marquise Goodwin, if Beathard indeed does come back, I think he could throw a lot worse arrows than that. Number 3 is Antonio Callaway from Cleveland. In Week 12, Callaway posted 4 catches for 62 yards as well as a touchdown. And we've seen Jarvis Landry out of whack a little bit in that offense. So Antonio Callaway, he's a big play threat. If you need a long shot here, I don't think you scare away from him. And number 4 is Marcel Aitman from Oakland, owned in 1% of Yahoo leagues. He had 10 targets in Week 12, only had 3 catches and made 16 yards with that, but he could see big volume again versus a shaky Chiefs D. So if you're down this low, Robert Foster, Marquise Goodwin, Antonio Callaway, and Marcel Aitman. Moving on to tight ends this week, my number 1 ad is Jonnu Smith from Tennessee, owned in 20% of Yahoo leagues. He had 2 catches for 61 yards and a touchdown in Monday Night Football in Week 12. Of course, he had a long touchdown. He's very athletic, looks to continue to find some success in this offense. Looks about one of the only consistent things to be in Tennessee right now. He has a tough matchup versus the Jets this week, but I do like him in a lack of plethora at tight end, so I would consider Jonnu Smith a back end tight end 1. Number 2 is Chris Herndon from New York Jets, owned in 6% of Yahoo leagues. Week 12, he had 7 catches on 8 targets for 57 yards. He continues to be about the only consistent thing in a bad offense in New York, so I would consider him a safe back-end tight end 1 this week. Next is CJ Uzomah from Cincinnati, owned in 26% of Yahoo leagues. With Jeff Driscoll in for Andy Dalton, Uzomah was targeted 10 of Driscoll's 36 throwing attempts, and even with the return of A.J. Green, I think Uzomah does find himself targeted often by Jeff Driscoll in this game as a safety valve, so I would consider C.J. Uzomah a high upside tight end 2, given the volume. And finally, from Denver, number 4, Matt Lacoste, owned in 1% of Yahoo leagues. He had 3 catches for 34 yards as well as a touchdown versus Pittsburgh in Week 12, filling in for the injured Jeff Hyman. And even when Hyman was on the field, it looked like Lacoste was the guy Case Keenum was preferring to look to. We've seen Keenum have success with tight ends time after time. He could be a sneaky tight end 1 in a great matchup versus the Bengals this week. So don't count Matt Lacoste out if you're looking low. He might be the play you need this week. If you're really looking at a risk-reward situation, those are the 4 tight ends I wanted to mention this week: Smith, Herndon, Uzomah, and Lacoste. And that does it for our offense. Now moving on to defense, we're going to start with our defensive backs. My number 1 defensive back ad this week is Jordan Whitehead from Tampa Bay, owned in 0% of Yahoo leagues. Over the last 2 starts, in Week 11, he had 8 tackles. In Week 12, 11 tackles. Even if Justin Evans does return this week, I think they're going to stick with Whitehead. The other safety position, I do like him a lot. They'll probably start him at strong safety. I think he's a key part of the defense moving forward. I would consider him a defensive back 2 with high upside versus Carolina in Week 13. And I think if Justin Evans does come back, I think it's going to be Isaiah Johnson that's going to maybe take the seat if they do plan to activate and give snaps to Evans once he comes back. But Isaiah Johnson, if Evans does sit again, he would be a strong safety play in his own right. In the last 2 games, recorded 16 tackles. So Jordan Whitehead and Isaiah Johnson, both solid ads if active in starting this week. Number 2 is Corey Graham from Philadelphia, still owned in 0% of leagues. Over the last 2 games, he's had 17 tackles. He gets Washington, who has allowed the most fantasy points to safeties. I would consider him a safe defensive back 1 this week. Go ahead and pick him up. He's available in 100% of Yahoo leagues. So Corey Graham, nice ad this week. Number 3, out of the doghouse now in Oakland, apparently, is Carl Joseph. He's owned in 1% of Yahoo leagues. Joseph has started the last 3 games. He's made good and had 18 tackles over those last 3 games. He's kind of returned to form out of West Virginia as a first-rounder. He was a highly touted prospect, even though he blew out his knee his last year at West Virginia. So Carl Joseph, nice to see him getting back to form. I'd consider him a defensive back 2 in Week 13 versus Kansas City. They'll probably be throwing, so I do think Carl Joseph will be a hot commodity in that one. Moving on, number 4, Jeff Heath from Dallas, owned in 14% of Yahoo leagues. In Week 12, he had 9 tackles, 2 tackles for loss, a pass defense, 1 forced fumble. And he gets a tasty Week 13 matchup versus the Saints. I would consider him a high-risk, high-reward defensive back, too. And moving on, number 5 is DJ Swearinger from Washington, owned in 35% of Yahoo leagues. Although he only had 5 tackles in Week 12, on the season he's had 41 tackles, a sack, 10 passes defensed, 4 interceptions, 3 forced fumbles. So as you can tell, he's a big-time playmaker for that Washington secondary. We've seen Philadelphia has looked a little bit off with Carson Wentz not returning to form after that knee injury, and Golden Tate not really showing up, Alshon Jeffrey not showing up consistently. So I do like DJ Swearinger to capitalize on some mistakes this week in Philadelphia. I would consider him a defensive back too. Moving into our linebackers now. My number 1 linebacker add this week is Zach Cunningham from Houston, owned in 5% of Yahoo leagues. He's averaging 8.7 tackles per game. He might still be available in your league. He had a couple weeks there where he wasn't playing. I wouldn't ooze over the rest of the season's schedule for him, but I would consider him a high-end LB2 for the rest of the season. So Zach Cunningham, if he's available, go and grab him for sure. Number 2 is Gerald Hodges from Arizona, owned in 2% of Yahoo leagues. We've seen Josh Bynes go on IR, and he was kind of the middleman for that defense. So Hodges, when Bynes was hurt, he stepped in and logged all defensive snaps after that injury, and he logged 10 tackles doing so in Week 12. So I do think Gerald Hodges is a nice play this week. My only concern here is they might throw Deone Buchanan at middle linebacker when he's healthy. I don't think he's going to play this week, but check on that, because if he does, they might start Buchanan there due to his versatility. But right now, Gerald Hodges looks like a nice linebacker to add. At number 3, Elijah Lee from San Francisco, owned in 1% of Yahoo leagues. He is the main benefactor from the Reuben Foster release. He's starting now. He's been starting earlier in the year for Foster, the first couple games when he was suspended himself. In Week 2 for the suspended Foster, Elijah Lee recorded 12 tackles, so he has big-time potential flash there. Obviously, he's faded a little bit. He's shown up last week in the absence of Foster, though. He had 7 tackles, so I would consider him a high-ceiling linebacker, too, in a tasty matchup versus Seattle, Week 13. Elijah Lee, nice pickup for this week. At number 4 is Alex Anzalone from New Orleans, owned in 0% of Yahoo leagues. He had 6 tackles, a pass defense, and a forced fumble in Week 12 versus Atlanta. He gets Dallas this week in another tasty matchup. Over the last 4 games, he's had 19 tackles. I would consider him a low-ceiling, high-floor kind of guy as a linebacker too. So Alex Anzalone at number 4. And number 5, Dorian O'Daniel from Kansas City, owned in 0% of Yahoo leagues. Now, this isn't a guy I'm recommending to go and pick up and start. However, I do think that he might have a chance to blow up this week. Last week, he made his first start over Reggie Ragland in the middle linebacker. And on the 5 games he's played this season, he's had 21 tackles. He's a rookie out of Clemson. He kind of plays that hybrid nickel role. He's playing on a Kansas City defense with the linebackers kind of uncertain behind Anthony Hitchens. He's a solid tackler we've seen against the run. But in coverage, pass coverage, they've been hurting, especially with Hitchens in the middle there. So Dorian O'Daniel, I think he has the juice. He has the talent to kind of be a playmaker in that defense. I wouldn't start him under any circumstances this week. However, I think there's worse bench stashes as far as IDP goes. I think Dorian O'Daniel, you can pick him up, put him on your bench, see where it goes. If not, cut him. He's an exciting rookie. I do think rookies are kind of a new breed in IDP. Rookies, they're trying to prove something. They have a chip on their shoulder. At the same time, they have a lot of juice. Sometimes at different positions, the game changes a lot. Say for a wide receiver, the game changes a lot from college to NFL. You have guys on you that are bigger, faster, stronger, different routes, different kind of abilities that cornerbacks have in the NFL compared to the NCAA. However, at a position like linebacker, the transition's quite simple, and I think Dorian O'Daniel gets it from Clemson. I think what he's seeing now is a lot of the same things he saw then in college. So I think he's going to be a linebacker to develop in the NFL here soon, and hopefully he shows it Week 13. And ladies and gentlemen, that does it for the podcast tonight on Johnny Freak in Fantasy Week 13 Waiver Wire Edition. This is the last podcast of the year. I hope you enjoyed your podcast listens. And we will see you after the NFL Draft, sometime to be announced on my Twitter at JohnnyFreakInF1. But without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, last sign-off for the year. We will see you. Good luck in not only Week 13, but your stretch run for the fantasy playoffs. Johnny Freak in Fantasy out.